It was one of those raw Chicago afternoons when the November wind comes barreling off Lake Michigan and every gust feels personal. Commuters hurried past in charcoal coats, heads down, boots crunching salt crystals that hadn't quite melted from last night's flurries. Inside the faded neon comfort of Harrison's diner, James Carter cupped his hands around a chipped ceramic mug, more for the warmth than the bitter coffee it held. At 34, he still looked every inch the fast-track consultant, slim navy suit, tie loosened just enough to say, "I work hard," hair swept back with practiced precision. But today the facade felt like a borrowed costume. 2 hours earlier, his largest client, one that paid 70% of his firm's invoices, announced they were realigning budget priorities. Translation: Goodbye, James. The loss meant layoffs at his tiny agency, rent in jeopardy for his River North apartment, and a phone call he was dreading to his mother who still believed her son's career was bulletproof. He told himself he'd come to Harrison's to sketch out a comeback strategy, but mostly he was there to keep from unraveling. Then, through the fogged-up window, a flash of determined color caught his eye, bright scarlet against the gray. A young woman, perhaps 20, sat cross-legged on the sidewalk in a second-hand red wool coat. One mittened hand cradled a cardboard sign, "Just a little hope would help," while the other gently scratched a stray tabby curled in her lap. Passers-by threw glances that slid off her like ice off a windshield. She simply smiled back, soft, unembarrassed, as though she knew a joke the rest of the world had missed. Something in that smile, the brave absurdity of it, yanked James up from his booth. He stepped outside, breath frosting the air. "Hey," he began, voice uncertain, "it's brutal out here. Have you eaten today?" The woman blinked as if returning from a daydream. "Not since yesterday." She nodded toward the cat. "But Ginger here scored half a sandwich." "Come on," he said, gesturing to the door. "Both of you." Inside, Harrison's felt warmer than James remembered. He asked the owner, Mrs. Patel, if pets were okay. She arched an eyebrow at the scruffy feline, then waved them toward a corner booth with a half-smile. When the waitress arrived, James ordered a full lumberjack breakfast for the woman, fluffy pancakes, scrambled eggs, turkey bacon after she quietly admitted pork made her queasy. For himself, another mug of the house sludge. Between tentative bites, she introduced herself. "Emily Dawson. I turned 20 last month." "How long have you been out here?" James asked gently. 419 days, Emily answered without hesitation. "Not that I'm counting." A wry grin. She told him about aging out of Illinois foster care, shuffled through 12 homes in 8 years, never staying long enough to celebrate a birthday twice in the same bedroom. She described the final night when a caseworker handed her a plastic bag of clothes, a preloaded bus card, and a pamphlet titled, "You've Got This." The exclamation mark felt like a taunt. James listened, really listened, until the diner's hum faded and it felt like they were the only two people on the planet. When he offered to cover a few nights at a youth shelter, Emily's response surprised him. "I appreciate it," she said, "but I've got a spot at Grace Outreach. Warmer than the street, and Gingers allowed in the basement. What I really need is someone to believe I can be more than a statistic." Her words lodged in his chest. Someone to believe. How long, James wondered, since anyone believed he could climb out of his own mess. As the plates were cleared, James slid a business card across the formica. "If you ever need anything, job advice, a reference, just coffee, call me." Emily tucked it inside her mitten and studied him. "You look like the one who could use coffee." She reached into her coat pocket, producing a single, neatly folded sticky note. On it she'd sketched a miniature scene of the diner, steam curls rising from a mug, sunlight slicing through blinds, a stray cat on a window ledge. Underneath she'd written in block letters, "Notice the good." "It helps," she said, pressing the note into his palm, "when life feels sideways." That evening, James pinned the note above his computer screen and, for the first time in days, opened a fresh proposal document. He drafted an audacious pitch to a regional eco-startup, something outside his usual corporate realm but infused with the storytelling spark Emily's drawing had ignited. Over the next week, he sought out ex-colleagues for advice instead of embarrassment. One meeting led to another. Momentum, once lost, began creeping back exactly where confidence had eroded. Meanwhile, he visited Grace Outreach on Sunday afternoons, ostensibly to drop off cat food. In truth, he came to hear Emily's book recommendations, she devoured second-hand paperbacks, and to witness how she lifted other residents' morale with doodles she taped to their bunk edges, tiny galaxies, laughing dinosaurs, the word, yet, scrawled beside half-finished dreams. On a frigid Friday night, James arrived to find Emily leading a circle of teens through improvisational storytelling, each person adding a sentence. They burst into applause when she wove a runaway dragon back home with an act of forgiveness. James realized she wasn't just surviving homelessness, she was rewriting it. He asked if she'd ever considered youth work professionally. Her face lit like a string of Christmas lights. I applied to the City College social work program, she admitted, but tuition, she trailed off, shrugging. James's proposal to the eco-startup landed a Monday morning interview. They loved his plan, but what sealed the deal was an off-the-cuff anecdote about resilience he'd learned from a young woman who sketches hope wherever she goes. They hired him on a retainer generous enough to steady his finances and leave room for something bold. Weeks later, he strode into Grace Outreach with 2 envelopes. One was a college scholarship application he'd persuaded his new client to sponsor, the other was an invitation for Emily to speak at their spring leadership retreat, paid honorarium included. But the front desk volunteer shook her head. Emily left yesterday. Don't know where. Panic tightened James's breath. He and Ginger scanned bus stops, train stations, alleyways where she sometimes sketched. Hours turned into dusk before he finally spotted her outside Union Station, talking earnestly to a man in a marine jacket holding a sign about PTSD. Emily's cheeks were blotchy, she'd been crying. James, this is Mr. Alvarez. He served 2 tours and lost his apartment. The shelter turned him away tonight, no beds for men. James felt the weight of a decision. He could tug Emily to safety or answer the broader call she embodied. He dialed 311, found a veteran-specific overnight facility, then paid for rideshares to ferry Mr. Alvarez and 2 other stranded vets across town. Emily watched, eyes shimmering. On the curb afterward, she confessed she'd almost hopped a bus to Indianapolis, another city, another gamble, until Mr. Alvarez reminded her of the why behind her own fight. We're all invisible till somebody waves. James handed her the scholarship packet. Tears gave way to laughter as she saw the logo, green leaf spiraling upward. You did this? You did, he corrected, recalling her sticky note mantra. I just noticed the good. By spring, Emily was enrolled in community college with a stipend from the Startups Foundation. In her spare hours she launched Sketch Forward, a pop-up art booth that sold postcard prints of her original doodles, half the proceeds funding art supplies for homeless youth. The local news featured her, donations and volunteers flooded in. James, meanwhile, rebuilt his agency with a mission shift, only clients whose products tangibly improved community well-being. 30% of profits now flowed into a microgrant program, first beneficiary, Sketch Forward. One May afternoon, he invited Emily to share her story on a live webinar for 300 corporate leaders. She practiced for days, terrified she'd freeze. Halfway through the broadcast, a thunderstorm knocked out power at the studio and Emily's screen went black. James's heart stopped, but Emily kept talking into the void, trusting audio still streamed. When lights flickered back, she was mid-sentence, because hunger isn't just about food. It's about hope. The chat erupted in applause emojis. Pledges topped $50,000 by nightfall. Success, however, doesn't immunize against setbacks. In late June, Chicago suffered its worst flash flood in decades. Grace Outreach's basement, Emily's former refuge, was ruined, displacing 80 young residents. Among the losses were storage bins of sketch-forward art supplies and the asthmatic cat Ginger had adopted as her own. Emily called James in tears, blaming herself for not securing a better facility sooner. James arrived to find her shoveling waterlogged sketchbooks into trash bags. "Everything I built is gone," she gasped. James remembered his own near-collapse months earlier, the day he first noticed Emily's stubborn smile. He knelt beside her and echoed her words, "Sometimes you're the helper and the helpless at once. We start again." Together they launched an emergency crowdfunding campaign. James leveraged every corporate contact. Emily live-streamed daily progress from the soggy shelter steps, stringing paper cranes behind her as a symbol of hope taking flight. Within 72 hours, they raised enough not only to relocate Grace Outreach to higher ground but to open a small art studio on site. On a warm August evening, a ribbon-cutting ceremony drew city officials, shelter residents, and strangers who had donated from across the continent. Emily stood at the podium clutching Ginger, miraculously found and returned by a vet tech who'd seen a social media post. Her voice trembled, not from nerves but gratitude. "A meal saved my stomach, but being seen saved my soul," she said, eyes locking with James. "Every sketch, every crane, every new bed upstairs is proof that kindness compounds faster than interest." She handed James a framed illustration, the diner booth where they first met, but now both windows were thrown open to a sunrise, and 2 mugs steamed side by side. Across the top she'd lettered, "Change someone's forever, theirs and yours." As applause rolled over them like a tide, James felt the earlier heaviness replaced by something light, almost buoyant. He'd gone from crisis to purpose, yes, but more profoundly, he'd discovered that generosity isn't a direction of travel, it's a loop where giver and receiver walk the same circle, each propelling the other forward. The next morning, national newspapers picked up the story. Former homeless artist and marketing exec transform flooded shelter into arts haven. The headline mattered less than the ripples it launched, calls from Detroit, Vancouver, Cardiff, asking, "How do we replicate this?" In a world quick to scroll past suffering, it turned out seeing was the revolutionary act. James's simple impulse to buy a stranger breakfast unlocked a chain of courage, opportunity, and community that neither could have triggered alone. Because kindness, once set in motion, is never linear, it's exponential. And if a down-on-his-luck consultant and a resilient 20-year-old dreamer could prove that on a wind-slapped Chicago curb, then perhaps the rest of us are only one small act away from changing someone's forever. Including our own.